When you think about it, how does a 45-year global standoff, a Cold War that could have turned hot at any second, how does something like that actually end? That's what we're going to dig into. We're looking at the dramatic final years of that conflict in this explainer, Echoes of the Iron Curtain.
For almost half a century, this was just the reality of the world. You had two superpowers, the United States on one side, the Soviet Union on the other. But this was so much more than just a military standoff. It was a battle of ideas, of ideologies that literally carved up the entire globe.
So that brings us back to the big question, right? When a conflict is that huge, that long, and it's fought with ideas just as much as with weapons, what does the end even look like? Let's take a look at the key moments that led to the whole thing coming down.
All right, so before we can talk about the wall falling, we really have to understand why it was there in the first place. The story of the end actually begins with these decades of intense rivalry, a period that shaped generations.
And really, if you strip everything else away, the Cold War boils down to just two words: decades of rivalry. That's the heart of it, a long, intense competition that played out all over the planet, all while everyone lived under the terrifying shadow of nuclear war.
So after this really long stalemate, the endgame starts moving incredibly fast. We're going to zoom in on two really critical years. 1987, which was this moment of a huge ideological clash, and then just 4 years later, 1991, when it all came to a head. I mean, how did the world change so much, so fast?
And that brings us right to 1987. This is one of those moments where words really became weapons, and they were delivered at the absolute epicenter of this divided world. And the location here was absolutely key. We're talking about the Berlin Wall. You have to remember, this thing was so much more than just concrete and barbed wire. It was the physical symbol of the Iron Curtain, built to literally keep people from leaving the East. It was a prison wall to one side and a hard line in the sand for the other, a literal wall between two different worlds. And then, this happens. A direct, public, completely unmistakable challenge. This wasn't some quiet note passed between diplomats. This was a demand, broadcast for the whole world to hear. The American president, Ronald Reagan, speaking directly to the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, and basically daring him to prove the Soviet system wasn't a prison, especially when Gorbachev was already trying to reform things.
But that famous line, it wasn't just about a physical wall. It was a shot aimed right at the core difference between the two superpowers. It all boiled down to one huge concept: what freedom really means.
So, why was the wall such a big deal? What was the fundamental idea that Reagan was trying to put front and center, not just for the people of Berlin, but for everyone?
And what's wild is that in that exact same speech, Reagan basically gives us the answer. He lays out the principle behind his challenge. He argues that the most important freedom isn't just about being able to move around. It's the ability to ask questions, to challenge authority, to find your own answers. And a wall, well, its whole purpose is to stop that from happening.
And so this is the choice he's really laying out for everyone to see. Is the future going to be a world of walls, of control, of division? Or is it going to be a world built on freedom, a world where you have the absolute right to question everything?
Now, of course, a single speech doesn't end a war, but this challenge landed at the perfect moment. It collided with all these huge pressures already building up. The Soviet economy was crumbling, Gorbachev himself was trying to make reforms, the whole thing created a kind of perfect storm, and those decades of rivalry just came to a stunning, rapid end.
And then, boom, 1991. Just think about that for a second. In only 4 years after that speech at the wall, the entire global order was completely turned on its head. With the Soviet Union officially dissolving, this central conflict that had defined pretty much the entire 20th century was almost unbelievably over. The rivalry that started right after World War II had finally ended.
So it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? The wall came down, the rivalry ended, but if we take that idea seriously, that freedom is the right to question, then what walls are still out there today? Maybe they're not made of concrete, but they're still dividing us. What echoes from that long conflict are still around, just waiting to be challenged, waiting to be questioned?